Once there was a man named Willie McRae. He lived in Scotland, and he lived by the sea, and he also made his living by the sea, for he was a shipbuilder and a craftsman, and he was so good at what he did that he was very busy building ships and fixing ships for others. Now they often say that the cobbler's children go barefoot, and that's how it was with Willie McRae. He had his own small craft, a little dinghy, but thanks to a wild wave and a sharp rock, it had a hole in the bottom. He'd been so busy fixing other people's ships that he hadn't had a chance to fix his own, and so it had sat for many months. But one day he had, unexpectedly, a free afternoon, and he thought, now I will fix my own dinghy. And so he examined the craft, and he saw the hole, and he realized that it needed a piece of wood of a certain length and a certain girth to be able to fix it. He went to his workshop, and although it was filled with all kinds of wood, all shapes, all sizes, there wasn't a single piece that was perfect for fixing that hole. And so with a sigh, he went out into the forest to find a piece of wood to fix his dinghy. And he walked farther and longer than he had anticipated, and maybe he was not paying close attention. But finally he realized that the sun was setting, it was getting dark, and a thick mist was beginning to rise. And he looked around and realized that he didn't know where he was. Now he'd always felt that he knew those woods just as well as he knew the back of his hand, but he was lost. And worse, he had no idea how to get back home. And so he had just resigned himself to spending the night there in the forest when he saw, glimmering through the trees, a light. And he thought, where there's a light, there are people. And so he went toward the light. Of course, that's always good advice, right? That's always what they tell you. Go toward the light. So he went toward the light, and there indeed was a cottage. He didn't remember there being a cottage in that part of the forest, but there was a cottage there. And it was inhabited, too. There was smoke coming out of the chimney, and there was light streaming out of the windows, and so Willie knocked at the door. The door was answered, and there was an old woman, a wrinkled face and gray hair, dressed all in black. Remind you of anyone you've met? Oh, she said, Willie McRae, you are welcome, as though she'd been expecting him. And standing behind her, he saw two other women who looked enough like the first that he knew that they were sisters. And so this is how it was. In Scotland, on the moors, on a misty night, three weird sisters. Sadly, Willie had never read Macbeth. So he went inside, and the first weird sister said, oh, we're just sitting down to supper. Won't you join us? And she indicated the table. The three sisters sat down, and there was a fourth place set, as though they'd been expecting him. She ladled him up a bowl of stew, and Willie wasn't thinking about the first rule of what you should do or shouldn't do when you're in the company of strange creatures, and that is, don't eat anything. Remember poor Persephone. But he wasn't thinking about that, and so he ate the bowl of stew, and he asked for a second. It was very good. It was sort of an unusual seasoning, but it was delicious, and so he finished off the second bowl as well. And then suddenly he felt overwhelmingly tired, and one of the sisters showed him to the guest room. It was all made up as though they were expecting him. It was very simple, just a bed, a table and chair, and a chest at the foot of the bed, and a peat fire smoldering in the fireplace. Now Willie had felt that he wouldn't sleep, but in fact, as soon as his head hit the pillow, he fell deeply and soundly asleep. Of course, he'd forgotten the second rule of what you shouldn't do if you find yourself in the company of strange creatures. You shouldn't go to sleep. Remember Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But he was sound asleep, and he only woke up when he heard the creak of the door, and opening his eyes just a little, he saw one of the weird sisters come into the room. She tiptoed over to the foot of the bed where that chest was. She raised the lid on the chest. She reached in and took out a red cap, which she placed on her head, and then she held up her hand and said, Here's off to London. And whoosh, she was gone up the chimney. Whew. Willie was almost back to sleep when the door opened a second time, and there was the second sister. She went over to the chest at the foot of the bed, opened up the lid, reached in, pulled out a red cap, put it on her head, held up her hand, and here's off to London. Whoosh, she was gone. Now he didn't even pretend to sleep. He just waited for the other shoe to drop, or the third shoe, since there were 3 of them. Well, I guess that would be 6 shoes. Anyway, he waited for the inevitable, and sure enough, the door opened. There was the third sister, and chest, lid, cap, head, hand, here's off to London. Whoosh. Well, now there was no reason for Willie to even pretend to be asleep. The 3 sisters were gone. And so he sat up in bed and he thought to himself, and you know what he decided to do. Yes, he went to the foot of the bed. He opened the lid of the chest. He looked inside. It was completely empty, except for 1 red cap, as though they'd been expecting him. He picked up the cap, he put it on his head, he raised his hand and said, here's off to London, and whoosh! Suddenly, Willie McPhie was flying so high and so fast he had to close his eyes, and then he landed with a thump in London. Well, he'd never been to London before, but it certainly looked like London, and he found himself standing right in front of a pub. And with all that had happened to him that day, Willie McPhie found himself in desperate need of a drink. So he went into the pub, he looked around, and there in the corner there was a table, and sitting at the table were the 3 weird sisters. When they saw him, they raised their glasses to him, and they motioned to him to come join them. There was a 4th chair, as though they'd been expecting him. But he shook his head and took a seat at the bar, and he ordered a drink, and then after a while, he ordered another one. It was a very busy scene there at the pub. People were singing and dancing and drinking and eating, and it was very noisy. But after a while, Willie saw out of the corner of his eye those 3 sisters stand up and put their caps on their heads. And he couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see their lips moving, and he could tell what they were saying. And what they were saying was, here's off to Kintail. And whoosh, 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 they were gone. Well, Willie thought, perhaps he should follow suit. And so he reached for his own red cap, which he had stuck in his belt. And then 2 things happened right away. The first was that a little yellow dog who'd been sleeping beside the bar woke up, ran over, snatched that red cap from Willie's belt, and ran out the door. And the second thing that happened was that the servant girl, you didn't think I was going to call her a wench, did you? No. Well, she came over with the bill. Willie looked at that bill and he gasped. Well, you remember when he'd started out that day, it was just to go into the woods to find a piece of wood. He didn't realize that he was going to need a wallet or money, so he had no money at all. And this bill was very high. It had not only the drinks that he'd ordered for himself, but apparently at some point he'd ordered a round for everyone in the pub. So this was clearly a sum that an evening of washing dishes was not going to cover. Well, the servant girl called the manager called the owner called the police, and Willie was arrested and taken off to jail. He tried to explain what had happened to him, but they didn't believe him, and the more he tried to explain, the worse everything got. And finally, he was charged with perjury and theft and witchcraft. His case came up for trial, and he was declared guilty and sentenced to be hanged. Now, in those days, they didn't wait around for any protracted appeal process or signing of any movie rights. They just carried out the sentence right away. And so Willie could hear that gallows being built in the courtyard in front of the jail. And the next morning, the jailer appeared, and he led Willie away into the courtyard where the platform was standing and the gallows with the noose hanging down. He led Willie up those 3 steps, and then the executioner put the noose around his neck. A large crowd had gathered. Apparently it was a slow news day. At any rate, a public hanging in those days was quite an attraction, a real event. And so there were a lot of people that had come to watch Willie McRae be hanged. The executioner said, "Well, do you have any last requests?" And Willie looked around. But there in the front of the crowd, he saw a boy, and next to the boy, that yellow dog. And the yellow dog still had the red cap in his teeth. "Yes," said Willie McRae, "I wish to be hanged with that red cap on my head." "An odd request," said the executioner, "but I suppose we could grant it." And so he went out, he asked the boy, he got the red cap, and he went back up the steps and put the red cap on Willie McRae's head. And almost as an afterthought, he said, "Well, do you have any last words?" "Yes," said Willie McRae. "Here's off to Kintail." And whoosh, he was gone. Now that day in London, and for many days after that, all the talk was of a man who'd been sentenced to be hanged. And there, standing on the platform with a noose around his neck, he had somehow escaped in a very unusual way. But Willie McRae landed with a thud back in the woods. And as he looked around, he did recognize the path that he was on, and he knew that if he followed that path, he'd get back to his own wee cottage. And so he started down the path. And then he thought about what had happened, and he had almost convinced himself that it was all a dream. But then he reached up, and he realized that he still had that noose around his neck. And at the end of the rope, there was a piece of the gallows. And looking at that piece of wood, Willie realized that it was exactly the right length and the right girth to fix his dinghy. And so that is exactly what he did.